Okay, thank you everyone for being here. Good morning. My name is Ziyana Kotadia. My pronouns are she, her, and today I am located on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, Lenape-Wauk, and Chinantan nations, which is colonially known as London, Ontario. I'm a student at Western University and the chair of the Safe Campus Coalition, the student organization behind the September 2021 anti-gender-based and sexual violence walkout at Western University. Today, student leaders and gender-based violence prevention advocates, including myself from the Safe Campus Coalition, Possibility Seed's Courage to Act project, Consent Action Team at Consent Comes First, the Ontario Undergraduate Students Alliance, and the PEARS project will be sharing remarks about our concerns and hopes for Bill 26. We'd like to take a moment before we begin to recognize that this work is taking place across the traditional, contemporary, and forever gathering places of many Indigenous nations. The work against gender-based violence is decolonial work, and the two cannot be separated. We recognize that gender-based violence is one form of violence caused by colonization that is still used today to marginalize and dispossess Indigenous peoples from their lands and their waters. Our work on campuses and in our communities must center this truth as we strive to end gender-based violence. We commit to learning and taking an anti-colonial, intersectional, inclusive approach to our work. There will be a few minutes at the end of our remarks for questions as well. I'll ask that you please use the raise hand function to voice your questions. If you're having any trouble at any point with anything technical or accessibility related during the session, please let Aubriana know by reaching out to her directly in the chat. She will be happy to assist you. And with that, we will get started. Bill 26, Strengthening Post-Secondary Institutions and Students Act, is a piece of legislation that has substantial power to impact the lives of those affected by gender-based violence on campus. This power can manifest in better protections for all of us, or it can cause much harm. The difference lies in some necessary amendments to this bill, which my colleague will speak about. The sections of this bill that focus on addressing campus gender-based violence are built on decades of important work by survivors and prevention advocates across the province of Ontario. And I would hate to see the province of Ontario miss the opportunity to work collaboratively on addressing these important issues that students' voices as advocates and survivors are really key to understanding how this legislation would actually be experienced by students. This bill fails to effectively consider the day-to-day realities of student life. Students are people with full lives and involvements in the university community outside of our positions purely as students. For example, many of us are also employees of the university, whether that be as research assistants, residence dons, teaching assistants, interns, or in other roles. As it stands, there's little consideration in Bill 26 for the potential overlap between student and employee roles, and this is a key gap that needs to be addressed. Another gap we'd like to see addressed is that those who are in a position of authority on campus without technically being employed by the institution may not be subject to the provisions in Bill 26. So in order to effectively account for the power dynamics at play in post-secondary institutions, we need Bill 26 to consider how positions of authority at universities can be occupied by people who are not classified as employees, such as guest speakers and lecturers, through university-facilitated mentorship and more. Ultimately, the really powerful potential of this bill is challenged by its loopholes and gaps that could serve to create harm for survivors under the guise of being survivor-centric legislation. These loopholes and gaps are a direct result of a failure to consult with student advocates on the bill itself. I've been a student at Western for 4 full years, and this is not the first time I've seen measures introduced to supposedly protect students that don't effectively do so because student voices were not baked into the formation of their language and intentions. So with that, I'm calling on the province of Ontario to work with student groups and gender-based violence prevention experts to make the necessary amendments to Bill 26 such that this legislation, which can have meaningful and powerful benefits for students and post-secondary communities, fulfills its mandate. Thank you very much. I'm going to pass it on to my colleague, Britney, for some remarks.
Thank you so much, Ziyana, and good morning, everyone. My name is Britney De Costa, and my pronouns are she, her. I'm the Experiential Learning Project Lead and co-lead of the Reporting, Investigations, and Adjudications Working Group with Possibility Seed's Courage to Act project. Echoing Ziyana, I want to acknowledge that Bill 26 contains many important steps in working against sexual violence on Ontario campuses, but there are significant shortcomings that need to be addressed. We are concerned that, should the bill move forward without amendments, the gaps it leaves in student protections will have unintended and harmful consequences. Specifically, I'd like to use this time to talk about the importance of minimum standards for institutions in addressing campus gender-based violence. Minimum standards are essential to providing institutions with the guidance needed to develop trauma-informed, intersectional, and consistent policies across institutions. We support the need for institutions to have clear policies for employee sexual misconduct as introduced in this bill, but we are concerned about how these policies will be developed and ultimately their effectiveness. Currently, all post-secondary institutions in the province are required to have a standalone sexual violence policy. Bill 26 will require a new policy be developed for employee sexual misconduct, which may be included in an institution's existing sexual violence policy. However, there are significant gaps in the minimum standards currently required for institutional sexual violence policies. These include basic components such as consistent, comprehensive definitions of sexual harassment and sexual violence. Minimum standards are key in ensuring the effectiveness of this legislation, and the government must work with key stakeholders to determine what these should be. We therefore ask that the Government Resources Standing Committee, led by key stakeholders, including students, survivors, unions, gender-based violence advocates, and administrators, to work together to create minimum standards, education programs, and protocols to address and prevent sexual violence and harassment on campus. This standing committee should include the Council of Ontario Universities, the Ontario Confederation of University Faculty Associations, the Ontario Undergraduate Student Alliance, the Canadian Federation of Students, PEARS, Prevention Empowerment Advocacy Response for Survivors, the Consent Action Team, and the Ontario Network of University Sexual Assault Centres. And this standing committee should build on the work that students and gender-based violence advocates have already done, including the list of 20 essential aspects of survivor-centric trauma-informed sexual violence policies in USA's Gender-Based and Sexual Violence Prevention and Response Policy Paper. Finally, we are concerned about the limited focus of the bill and the lack of inclusion of recommendations from student leaders, faculty and staff, frontline workers, researchers, and advocates that would more effectively address the issue of sexual violence on campus. I would specifically like to highlight the current gap in protections for students in experiential learning positions. Students rely on experiential learning opportunities to complete their education and gain meaningful employment post-graduation, yet they're uniquely vulnerable to sexual harassment in the workplace due to power differentials between students, employers, supervisors, and instructors. Courage to Act is leading the first national research to action project exploring this issue. And in this work, we've heard from students that they feel sexual harassment is the price they have to pay to be in their industry, or that they have decided to leave their chosen field because it isn't safe for them. We know this government is prioritizing experiential learning. However, as exemplified in the gaps in this bill, there is a missed opportunity to address a significant barrier to safely accessing these opportunities. A first step is ensuring that the scope of sexual misconduct policies explicitly includes students participating in on and off campus experiential learning. This is an example of a minimum standard that we would like to see. And on behalf of Possibility Seeds and Courage to Act, we urge the government to consider the amendments proposed in submissions to the Standing Committee on Social Policy regarding Bill 26, and to take up our recommendations to those that have continuously been advocating for by students across the province for a more comprehensive and effective approach to meeting our shared goal of ending gender-based violence on campus. Thank you. I'll now pass it over to Keneisha.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Keneisha Charles. My pronouns are they, them. I'm a fourth-year social work student and a member of the Consent Action Team at Toronto Metropolitan University. One of the pieces which holds the most potential for both protection of and harm to survivors is contained within subsection 5, the piece around permittance of non-disclosure agreements, or NDAs. Prince Edward Island brought forward legislation this spring regarding the application of NDAs in instances of sexual violence, and I'd like to specifically call on the Ontario government to follow PEI's lead in the way this legislation is drafted. In PEI, a non-disclosure agreement is only permitted when requested by the survivor. This is such an important piece of ensuring that survivors maintain control over their own lived experiences and stories, and Bill 26 needs to be amended to reflect this. As it's currently written, Bill 26 only disallows NDAs following the arbitration stage of an investigation, which leaves survivors in limbo for a good portion of the investigation should they choose to pursue one. Paying lip service to banning NDAs without actually taking the necessary steps to ensure that survivors are protected only leaves more room for those who commit harm to take advantage of regulatory loopholes. We deserve better. Now I'd like to pass it on to Jessica.
Thank you, Keneisha. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. My name is Jessica Look. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the president of the Ontario Undergraduate Student Alliance, or USA for short. USA represents over 150,000 students from 10 universities across Ontario. Sexual violence is an ongoing issue on post-secondary campuses and has become one of the top concerns of students across Ontario. USA has been deeply involved in the work to advocate for those affected by campus sexual violence in Ontario, and we have always advocated for gender-based and sexual violence policies to be trauma-informed and survivor-centric. We appreciate the work the Ministry of Colleges and Universities has done over the past few years to strengthen the GBSV policies at post-secondary institutions and welcome Bill 26 as a first step. However, there needs to be changes made to make this legislation more trauma-informed and survivor-centric. As mentioned by Keneisha, USA is also concerned with Section 5, where NDAs are disbarred after arbitration. This does not prioritize the safety and respect for survivors, since NDAs or confidentiality agreements are enacted at earlier stages of the investigation and does not encompass all instances in which they are used against students. Additionally, in some instances, NDAs may be wanted by the complainant, and barring their access to privacy can be re-traumatizing, cause harm, and discourage survivors from coming forward in the first place. Trauma-informed and survivor-centric adjudication processes are important because they work to enhance procedural fairness. Bill 26 offers promises of resolutions for faculty-perpetrated gender-based violence, but would actually be more cumbersome for survivors needing to go through a judiciary process to avoid an NDA. We recommend the language in Section 5 be expanded to encompass all instances in which NDAs are used, and USA would also like to echo calls for the ministry to look at PEI NDA Bill 118 as a best practices framework. Our second point of concern lies in Section 7. It calls on all institutions to have sexual misconduct policy with minimum inclusions of rules relating to sexual behavior involving employees and students, as well as disciplinary actions for those who breach the policy. USA is pleased to see that the ministry is mandating inclusion of disciplinary action and rules around misconduct and sexual violence, but we are concerned at the vagueness of this amendment. When the Ministry of Colleges and Universities involved USA in consultations on this last year, our immediate response to questions about disciplinary measures were that they must be trauma-informed and survivor-centric. However, leaving each institution to create their own set of guidelines and policies without best practices does not ensure that all institutions will be working in a trauma-informed and survivor-centric manner. Additionally, the amendments to this bill operate under the use of the term sexual abuse and then allows institutions to define sexual abuse in their own policies in Section 8. There is a lack of unified and standardized language on how post-secondary institutions will be approaching gender-based and sexual violence, which could lead to discrepancies across the sector. USA recommends that the ministry continue to work with sector stakeholders such as the Council of Ontario Universities, the Ontario Confederation of University Faculty Associations, USA, Possibility Seeds, and the Ontario Network of University Sexual Assault Centres in order to create best practices. We also want to recommend that the Ministry of Colleges and Universities adopt the language of sexual violence and sexual harassment over sexual abuse, which is the standard used in Section 17 currently, and ensure that there is a standard definition across institutions. Additionally, we want to recommend that the ministry consult previous materials provided by USA regarding sexual violence policies and adopt the remaining amendments to build a more robust, trauma-informed, and survivor-centric framework for Ontario institutions. Again, USA is pleased to see the efforts made by the Ministry of Colleges and Universities, but more needs to be done in order to ensure the safety of students is protected through this legislation. Thank you. I'd love to pass it on to Micah.
Thank you so much, Jessica, and good morning, everyone. My name is Micah Kalisch. I use she, her, and they, them pronouns, and I'm a fourth-year undergraduate student at the University of Toronto. I'm also the founder and the director of the PEARS project, which is a grassroots student and survivor-led organization that operates across all three of U of T's campuses. So much of what my colleagues have already spoken to, I wish to speak to today. One of those major issues is the way in which this legislation leaves these practices up to the institutions. And as survivors and as students, we've seen time and time again that these institutions are going to prioritize the well-being of their staff, their employees, in an attempt to protect their image. And this happens even when those employees are perpetrators of violence. So best practices and minimum standards must be set for disciplinary measures to ensure that survivors are actually being kept safe on campus and that we don't have to walk hallways with our perpetrators and with our abusers. Beyond this, minimum standards and best practices must be set for things like consultations on policy changes and on how investigation processes need to take place. Not only will this ensure accountability within the institution, but it's going to prevent PSIs from allowing harm to continue by allowing these actors to remain on campus and work with students. Another major issue within this legislation is the way that it does not effectively combat NDAs. So NDAs are a major barrier for survivors accessing support. Oftentimes they're presented as the only option, or survivors are coerced into signing these or feel they have no alternative. We're concerned about the effectiveness of banning NDAs through this legislation, as currently NDAs would only be prohibited following arbitration. We need to see consistent regulation of non-disclosure agreements throughout this legislation and throughout the entire process that a survivor may be engaging in. There's also some major issues with ambiguity and vague wording throughout this bill, which prevent survivors from having a clear understanding of what processes would look like. If a student or a survivor is unable to understand this bill, then it cannot and is not survivor-centric or trauma-informed. If this is intended to protect us and support us, we need to be able to engage with this content in a meaningful way. Finally, not only does this vague wording result in survivors being unaware, but it also allows a very dangerous precedent in which universities can provide minimal discipline and keep dangerous employees on campus and interacting with students. And this is something that we continue to see every day. Survivors have been dismissed and neglected by our government for years. And with the creation of new legislation, we need to ensure we're creating comprehensive programming and robust options for survivors seeking support and resources. We need adequate consent education and clear rights outlined in our policies. We need our policies to be created by and for survivors, and anything less than that is being complicit in the violence and the neglect and negligence that takes place on our campuses today. As survivors and as students, we deserve better, and we deserve for our voices to be heard. For the government to push this legislation through as is without listening to the voices of survivors currently would be absolutely unacceptable and incredibly harmful to survivors across post-secondary institutions everywhere. Thank you.
Thank you, Micah, and thank you so much to all of the students and advocates who've shared their thoughts. We will now be moving into a question period. So if you do have a question, please raise your hand and we will call on you to deliver that question. And when you speak, if you can please direct your question to the person you would like to receive an answer from, that would be great. I'm seeing a hand from Chris. Please go ahead.
Hi, thanks. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great, thank you. I'm just wondering if you can maybe talk a little bit more about the issue you have around NDAs, and you mentioned PEI. So what does PEI have that you would like to see here? What changes to the government does the government need to make on that front?
Absolutely. Do you have anyone in particular you'd like responding to your question?
No, whoever would like to. Thank you.
Okay, great. Would any members of our panel like to address that question?
I can address it. One of the key differences with PEI's legislation and this bill is that PEI allows the use of NDAs when requested by the survivor, whereas this bill doesn't mention it, it just disallows them after that arbitration process. So having that element of choice is really important so that a survivor can choose whether or not they want that confidentiality or not.
Thank you, Keneisha, and thank you, Chris. Are there any other questions?
Yeah, sorry, can I just follow up on that question? So you're saying that you'd like the survivor to be able to request an NDA? And would there be any worries in that case about coercion?
We want it to be the survivor's choice at the end of the day. What we see a lot of times in the cases of NDAs is that it bans students from speaking up and voicing their concerns and being public in the way that they want. But sometimes that confidentiality is requested. So we want it to be free and open for the survivor to choose the path that they want going forward.
We have a couple of additional remarks. Britney, if you want to go ahead.
Sorry. Thank you very much, and thank you, Keneisha, for saying that. One of the pieces that I just like to point out is in PEI's legislation, specifically sections 4.2 and 4.3. They speak to allowing survivors to, or the person who was harmed, to request a confidentiality agreement, but there's specific requirements and protections in place to protect against that undue coercion and undue influence. So things like ensuring that the person requesting the confidentiality agreement has a reasonable opportunity to receive independent legal advice, that there were no undue attempts to influence the relevant person in respect to the decision to include a requirement not to disclose any material information, and ensuring that the agreement does not adversely affect the health or safety of a third party, the public interest, and that the agreement includes an opportunity for the relevant person to decide to waive their own confidentiality in the future and the process for doing so, as well as including a time limit or a limited duration. So with some of those protections in place, that gives the survivor choice and agency, but also helps to protect them from some of the undue influence and some of the coercion that's present when NDAs are used or misused in the way they are now.
Thank you. And I believe Micah had something to add on as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you, Keneisha and Britney. And thank you, Britney, to speaking to those specific sections of the policy there. I won't reiterate, but I do want to echo all of what Britney has said, and I think highlight the way that PEI's legislation really amplifies choice and agency for the survivor, which are fundamental aspects to having policies that are survivor-centric and trauma-informed. And currently, we don't see that same level of choice and agency within the Ontario government's legislation. When we're talking about NDAs as well, I think it's important that we note that institutions are incredibly powerful organizations. Post-secondary institutions have tons of financial and legal resources at their disposal. And so I think that this legislation is naive in the fact that it does not recognize the way we have seen confidentiality agreements weaponized in a way in which they're not labeled as NDAs, but they do the same thing in silencing survivors. So the regulations need to be very, very clear so that we do not see institutions using other forms of legal documents to silence survivors when that is not what they want.
Thank you, Micah. Do we have any other questions? Okay, seeing none, thank you for the questions that were asked. To wrap up, I would like to reiterate that in order to successfully center and support all those affected by campus gender-based violence, Bill 26 needs a trauma-informed, survivor-centric approach throughout the legislation. Clear, accessible, and consistent language, including changing the term from sexual abuse to sexual violence and sexual harassment, as well as amending the bill to include consistent language that all institutions can use regarding definitions of harm. We need consideration of dual roles that students might occupy, experiential learning, and the various power dynamic complexities that come with being a member of a broader campus community. We need a better approach to regulating NDAs at all stages of the complaints process, not just after a decision is made. We need to amend the bill to include the clauses from PEI's Non-Disclosure Agreements Act, specifically sections 2.4 and 4.2 and 4.3, which create opportunities for a trauma-informed and healing-centered approach. We need minimum standards for sexual violence policies, as well as a mandate that post-secondary institutions create standalone statements on relationships between students and employees. We need to ensure adequate and sustainable funding for addressing and preventing gender-based violence on and off campus. And we need to center the voices of students and survivors. The province needs an advisory committee on campus sexual violence with paid roles for students and survivors to work together to create minimum standards, education programs, and protocols to meaningfully address and prevent sexual violence and sexual harassment on campus. With that, I will do one last call for questions if anyone has anything else they'd like to ask. Okay. Seeing no other hands, thank you very much for your time. Please do reach out to us if you have additional questions, and we really appreciate you being here.